After Regis Philbin passed away in 2020, his former Beverly Hills home, an elegant Mediterranean-style property tucked into the hillside, was sold to a couple from New York, Matthew and Claire Reynolds. They weren't celebrities or socialites, just a successful marketing executive and his wife who dreamed of a quieter life in Los Angeles. The house had charm. Arched windows, a tiled courtyard, and a sweeping view of the city. From the beginning, however, neighbors told them stories. Regis was known for his boundless energy, his booming laugh, and his inability to sit still. Some claimed that even after his death, his presence hadn't left the house. Matthew and Claire smiled politely, chalking it up to Hollywood gossip. Within weeks, the couple noticed peculiar things. At night, Claire often heard what she described as a television voice, a booming male tone echoing faintly through the halls. Thinking Matthew had left a TV on, she would check, only to find the screens dark. Doors they swore were locked would swing open. The kitchen radio, which they never used, turned itself on at 2 or 3 a.m., always set to a talk show station. Once, Matthew heard loud clapping in the living room as if an audience applauded though the room was empty. The most unsettling moment came when Claire went into the basement to retrieve boxes. The air felt heavy, unusually warm, and from the corner of her eye she saw a figure tall, silver-haired, in a dark suit standing near the staircase. She froze, convinced someone had broken in. But when Matthew rushed down, no one was there. She later described the man's face. Wide smile, intense eyes, features unmistakably similar to Regis himself. When the Reynoldses confided in a neighbor, the woman didn't look surprised. She told them Regis often joked that he would never retire, that even in death he would still be on stage. Another neighbor added that before the house went on sale, cleaners complained of hearing a man laughing behind them, though they were alone. Rather than put the house back on the market, Matthew and Claire tried to adapt. They left a light on in the den where Regis once entertained guests, believing it calmed the disturbances. Occasionally, they even greeted the presence when things grew too eerie. Matthew admitted in private that some nights, he heard Regis's distinctive laugh echoing faintly through the courtyard. For now, they remain in the house, balancing admiration for its history with unease at sharing it with a former host who, it seems, never stopped performing. The Reynolds couple had always thought of Los Angeles as a city that never truly went quiet. Distant traffic, coyotes on the hills, helicopters circling. But in their new home, silence itself felt unnatural, as if the house only grew still to make the smallest sounds louder, more noticeable, more deliberate. At night, Claire would lie awake in the master bedroom, staring at the carved ceiling beams that stretched across the room like the ribs of an ancient skeleton. She tried to ignore the creaks, the faint humming that sometimes seemed to come from inside the walls, and the soft flicker of light from the den downstairs. Matthew had begun closing every door at night, locking them, double-checking every latch, yet by morning at least one door was always ajar. The same door, usually the one that led from the dining room into the courtyard. It wasn't just the sound of a voice anymore. It was the rhythm of one cadence. Claire described it best one late evening when she sat with her husband at the kitchen table, too nervous to go upstairs. "It's not random," she whispered, clutching her tea with both hands. "It's like someone is delivering a monologue. Like I'm listening through a wall to a speech I can't quite make out." Matthew didn't answer. He had heard it too, faintly, drifting up through the house as if the very rooms themselves were holding on to echoes of an audience long gone. There was another peculiarity, a scent. It began in the den, the very place Regis was said to have kept memorabilia from his long career. The room had been stripped bare when the Reynoldses moved in, yet some nights, an unmistakable aroma filled the air. Hot stage lights, mingled with the faint chemical tang of hairspray and makeup powder. Claire would catch it as she walked past the door, stop in her tracks, and realize the smell was strongest near the window where Regis once filmed casual segments for television. One evening Matthew invited a colleague over for dinner. As they sat in the den, the guest paused mid-conversation and sniffed the air. "It smells like a dressing room," he said casually, "like someone just powdered their face." Matthew and Claire exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. The most disturbing moment so far came late one Thursday night. Claire had fallen asleep on the couch, the television muted, when she woke to the unmistakable sound of applause. Not just clapping, full, thunderous applause, like an audience cheering a host onto a stage. Her body froze. She sat upright, straining to hear. The sound wasn't coming from the TV, it was coming from the house itself, vibrating faintly through the floors, echoing off the tiled hallway. She whispered Matthew's name, but he was upstairs. For a full 30 seconds she sat paralyzed, listening as the clapping rolled and thundered, only to fade as suddenly as it began. When Matthew rushed downstairs at her scream, the house was once again silent. The only trace left was a faint vibration in the glass cabinet doors, as if something far louder had only moments before filled the space. The next morning, Claire went to speak with a neighbor, a retired woman who had lived on the street for decades. At first she was reluctant, but when pressed, she admitted that many people had avoided the house since Regis's passing. "He was so alive," the neighbor said softly, standing in her rose garden, her pruning shears frozen in her hand. "Some people are just larger than life. They don't leave quietly, not even after death." She recalled how, during the weeks after his death, several workers who came to clean and stage the home swore they heard footsteps and laughter. One even left mid-shift, refusing to come back. Claire returned home shaken. She hadn't told the woman about the applause. She hadn't needed to. The Reynoldses were beginning to realize they hadn't just bought a house, they had stepped onto a stage that still belonged to someone else. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. By October, the Reynoldses had grown used to small disturbances. The smell of makeup powder, the late-night hum of invisible voices, the occasional clapping that rippled through the walls. But now the house had begun to shift into something more deliberate, as if it were no longer content with being a passive backdrop. The den, once their favorite room with its high arched windows and soft golden light, became nearly unlivable. It was always colder than the rest of the house, a sharp drop that forced Matthew to check the vents more than once. No problem was ever found. Yet whenever either of them entered, a faint static charge seemed to press against their skin, like the buzzing air before a thunderstorm. One night, Matthew lingered by the den's doorway while Claire sat on the couch flipping through a magazine. The silence was heavy, unnatural. Then, without warning, the overhead lights flicked on, blinding bright. Claire gasped, shielding her eyes. The bulbs dimmed back to normal almost instantly, but the impression was clear. The lights hadn't malfunctioned. They had flashed on, like stage lights being raised on a performer stepping into view. It was during the following week that Matthew began hearing Regis's voice distinctly for the first time. Not the muffled cadence from behind the walls, this was clearer, more intentional, as though coming through a microphone. One night, while brushing his teeth, he froze at the sound of a booming introduction echoing faintly down the hallway. "And here we go, folks, tonight's the night." The words dissolved before they could form into a sentence. He spat into the sink and gripped the counter, staring at his pale reflection. His chest hammered as though he had just been thrust beneath a spotlight himself. When he told Claire, she pressed her lips tightly together. "I've been hearing him too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't want you to think I was losing it." The strangest phenomenon, though, unfolded in the courtyard. The house's layout surrounded this open square, a tiled Mediterranean-style patio with a small fountain at its center. The Reynoldses often left the windows cracked at night to let in air. One night, around 2 in the morning, Claire was woken by the murmur of voices drifting up through the courtyard. She nudged Matthew awake, and together they stood at the window, listening. It wasn't just one or two voices, it was many. A crowd. Dozens, maybe more. They spoke over one another in indistinct chatter, rising and falling in tone. Every so often, a burst of laughter erupted, followed by the low rustle of what could only be applause. Matthew rushed downstairs and opened the courtyard doors, expecting to see a group of teenagers trespassing. But the patio was empty, the fountain trickling softly, the tiles gleaming under the moonlight. The voices, however, continued all around him, circling the air like a restless crowd waiting for the show to begin. When he stepped forward, the sound collapsed into silence so quickly it left his ears ringing. He turned back toward the house and saw Claire at the window above, pale and wide-eyed. She mouthed a single word to him, audience. The more they tried to ignore it, the worse it became. The house wanted acknowledgement, recognition, participation. Regis had spent his life before cameras, and it seemed even death had not ended his performance. One night, Matthew gave in. After the house erupted in faint clapping and laughter again, he stood in the den and raised his voice. "All right," he said, his throat dry. "We hear you." The clapping stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so absolute it made Claire grip his arm until her nails dug into his skin. Then, from the corner of the room, came the faint sound of a man clearing his throat, the distinct, sharp preparation of someone about to speak into a microphone. But no words came, only the heavy presence of anticipation, as if the house was waiting for them to continue the act. The Reynoldses were beginning to understand that Regis's house was not haunted in the ordinary sense. It wasn't merely echoes or cold drafts or fleeting figures. It was a stage, and every night they lived there, they were being asked, against their will, to play their part. By November, the Reynoldses had stopped inviting guests over. Friends who came for dinner would glance around uncomfortably, remark on drafts that weren't there, or frown at odd bursts of static on their phones. One guest even claimed her smartwatch started buzzing with notifications that didn't exist as soon as she stepped into the den. Matthew and Claire tried to maintain normal routines, cooking, working remotely, taking walks through the hills, but they both felt the house looming over every hour of their lives. It wasn't just at night anymore. In broad daylight, the house seemed to hum with unseen energy, like a machine that never powered down. Claire noticed it first while folding laundry. The house had a pulse, a rhythm, not a sound exactly, but a vibration in the floors, a subtle pressure in the walls. It rose and fell in waves, the same way an audience does when waiting for a show to begin. The realization left her trembling. The house isn't quiet. It's breathing. They tried to capture it. One Saturday, Matthew set up a small digital recorder in the courtyard overnight, hoping to prove or disprove their experiences. In the morning, they sat together at the kitchen table, listening to the playback. For the first hour, nothing unusual. The trickle of the fountain, the occasional dog barking in the distance. Then, faintly, the sound of chatter. At first indistinct, then clearer, overlapping voices filling the space. At one point, a man's voice rose above the rest, booming, familiar, filled with energy. "Are you ready, folks?" The tape hissed and cracked, then fell into silence. Claire pressed pause, her hand shaking so hard she nearly dropped the recorder. "That's him," she whispered. "That's his voice." They didn't finish the playback. They couldn't. The device was locked in a drawer, where neither of them dared touch it again. A week later, on a cool, windy night, Claire stepped out into the courtyard alone. The fountain's steady trickle filled the air, and she tilted her head back, staring up at the second-story balcony. For a heartbeat, she saw him, a tall, silver-haired man standing against the railing, shoulders squared, looking down at her as if she were a member of the crowd. His mouth was open mid-speech, his hands gesturing animatedly. No sound came out, yet she felt the performance as clearly as if the words had reached her. She stumbled backward, her breath catching. When she blinked, the figure was gone. But the sense of being addressed, of being directly spoken to, lingered. When she finally told Matthew, his face drained of color. He had seen the same figure 2 nights earlier, standing in the hallway mirror when no one was behind him. The Reynoldses began to notice the house dictating their movements. Whenever they tried to avoid the den, doors would swing open by themselves, lights flickering to guide them back. If they lingered in the courtyard too long, the voices would rise, pressing them to stay. Even the kitchen seemed infected. Appliances clicked on without reason. The faint buzz of a microphone hum would bleed into the silence. Matthew confessed to Claire one night that he felt watched every time he sat at the dining table. Not by one figure, but by many. The weight of an audience pressing in, unseen, waiting for him to slip into the role of entertainer. Claire, meanwhile, started dreaming of red curtains. Heavy velvet drapes that never fully opened, no matter how she tugged. Behind them, she could sense movement, but never see who waited there. She woke one night to find she had whispered Regis's name in her sleep. The Reynoldses were no longer simply living in a house. They were occupying a theater without exit, the spotlight slowly tightening on them both. And the show was only beginning. The air inside the house grew heavier as December set in, as though the walls themselves had absorbed too much of the presence within. The Reynoldses noticed time moving strangely. Nights stretched into endless hours of wakefulness, while days slipped by in a blur of fatigue and dread. They began arguing, not out of dislike, but out of exhaustion. Claire wanted to leave. Matthew insisted they stay. He argued they couldn't sell the house without destroying their savings, but beneath his reasoning was something deeper. A strange loyalty, even fascination, with Regis's lingering energy. He told Claire, almost defensively, "He's not trying to hurt us. He just doesn't want to be forgotten." But Claire knew better. She felt it in her chest at night, lying awake with her heart racing, listening to the unseen crowd stir in the courtyard. They weren't there for Regis anymore. They were there for them. It happened during a stormy night when heavy rain pelted the tiled roof, masking the usual sounds of the house. Claire was startled awake by the familiar sound of clapping, sharper than ever before. It wasn't muffled. It wasn't distant. It was inside the bedroom, surrounding her. She sat upright, the hair on her arms prickling, and turned toward Matthew. He was sitting at the edge of the bed, already awake, his face pale in the flicker of lightning from outside. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. He nodded slowly. "They want us downstairs." The words chilled her because they weren't his. The tone, the cadence, the energy, it was Regis's voice, coming out of her husband's mouth. Claire grabbed his arm, begging him not to go, but Matthew stood as though pulled by strings. He walked slowly, deliberately, down the hallway, each step echoing like the deliberate approach of a man toward a stage. When Claire finally followed, heart pounding, she found the den ablaze with light. Every lamp, every overhead bulb glowed at full brightness, casting the room into a blinding stage-like brilliance. The smell of makeup powder and heated electrical equipment filled the air. Matthew stood in the center of the room, his face vacant, his arms slightly raised, as though basking in an invisible spotlight. Claire could feel it too, the presence of hundreds, maybe thousands of unseen spectators packed into the space around her. The den had dissolved into a theater, its walls vibrating with the roar of a crowd that didn't exist. And then came the voice, Regis's voice, booming from everywhere and nowhere. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's special guests Matthew and Claire Reynolds." Thunderous applause erupted, shaking the glass cabinets, rattling the chandelier. Claire fell to her knees, covering her ears, but the sound poured straight into her bones. Matthew raised his head, smiling in a way that wasn't his own. Claire screamed his name, rushing forward to grab him. At that moment, every light in the house blew out with a sharp, violent pop. The room plunged into darkness, and with it, silence. The audience had vanished. The den was just a den again, its windows rattling softly from the storm outside. Matthew collapsed to the floor, gasping as if surfacing from underwater. When Claire held him, he sobbed into her shoulder, repeating the same words over and over. "I could hear them. I could see them. They wanted us to perform." The next morning, without speaking, the couple packed what they could fit into their car and drove away. They didn't list the house for sale immediately, too shaken, too afraid of what disclosure might mean. Instead, they locked it, left the keys with their realtor, and never stepped inside again. Neighbors later reported hearing laughter echoing from the courtyard in the weeks after, long after the house stood empty. The lights flickered on by themselves. Gardeners claimed they felt watched as they trimmed the hedges. A delivery man swore he heard applause erupting from inside as he dropped a package at the door. The house remains, beautiful and sunlit by day, but at night, those who walk by say it feels alive, waiting. waiting for its next audience, waiting for its next hosts, and perhaps most unsettling of all, more than one neighbor has claimed, in passing, to hear a voice drifting on the night air, warm and booming, always the same line. Are you ready, folks? Because the show must go on. Would you spend a night here? Comment below. Which house should I do next?